How do you balance Indigenous and Christian traditions in preschools and schools? Are there any barriers for teachers and educators to bringing Indigenous traditions into the curriculum? And if you have questions, where do you find answers and relevant resources? Well, you will soon hear answers to these questions from a Christian educator, writer, and artist. But first, let me give you a quick overview of what's gone on before. The first part of this inquiry, Indigenous and Christian Traditions Together, a Paradox, looked at this issue quite broadly. I used 4 examples: art, symbolism, land, and afterlife to explain my position, and also shared with you why am I actually doing this inquiry. And then you heard 2 interviews. All interviews included in the inquiry are with Christian educators and teachers, Indigenous to different parts of the world, including Australia. So, 2 takeaways. Number 1, prior to the inquiry, I have never spoken with a Christian Aboriginal educator. And the second takeaway, that one was with Anna, was how she distinguishes between black and white church. So if you are interested, go and watch that interview of the part 1 of the inquiry. The second part of this inquiry, titled "Is Planting Native Christmas Bush Tokenistic?", looked at 3 areas where it's relatively easy to see commonalities: planting native Christmas bushes, smoke, and fire. And the question there was, are these common themes prove that there is actual common ground between both traditions, Indigenous and Christian, or is it tokenistic? Second interview of this series with Leaf, who is a Christian educator, included that question of, hey, how do you actually determine what's tokenistic? And her answer, I would encourage everyone to go and listen to, because that's fantastic. Everyone can do it. You don't need any tools, you don't need anything, and it's so far the best answer I heard for determining what's tokenistic. So if you're into that, go to the second part of this inquiry, also in the description. And today, you're going to hear from Priyanka her tips on what can teachers and educators do. This is our final interview of this inquiry, and I'm very grateful to be here today with Priyanka Bromhead, who is a Christian writer, teacher, educational consultant, and multidisciplinary artist. Is that correct, Priyanka?
Yes, hi. Hi, thanks, Jan, for having me.
Fantastic. Awesome.
Yeah, I'm here. I'm on Darug country this morning or this afternoon now. I'm very grateful to be a part of your inquiry.
Yeah. That's amazing. Without you and other educators and teachers, and yeah, this wouldn't be good. So let's go right into the questions. So first question is, what symbolizes Christian traditions to you? What comes to your mind?
Yeah, so when I think of Christian practices and traditions, I think of the way my creator longed for a relationship with us as humans, created people in his image, and that was broken, that relationship. And despite that, he still pursued us, we were still pursued, and God came as person here onto earth and continued to pursue us, and despite the rejection that was received, still went to the cross for us. And as we know, it didn't stop there. We are very blessed and live in hope because of the resurrection as well. So those 3 things are probably kind of at the peak of Christian practice for me.
What symbolizes Indigenous traditions to you?
So I guess when we talk about Indigenous practices, both here on the land that we call Australia and across the globe, I think of caring for country and caring for community. Those are the 2 things that come to mind.
For you as a Christian teacher and educational consultant, do you see both traditions, Christian and Indigenous, to be different or similar to each other?
Look, I think before I can answer this question, it's important to define what Christianity means to me. Mainstream Christianity and Indigenous practices, I don't think are aligned. However, if we're to really go back to Genesis and look at the way that we as humanity were called to care for the land in stewardship, I think those are really aligned with the Indigenous practices. I mean, those are Indigenous practices, you know, like to care for community, each other, you know, develop bonds of kinship, but not just with people, with, you know, animals, live in sustainable ways that protect the earth as well. So I think that ancient biblical practices are Indigenous practices, and the way that Indigenous people live their lives, you know, today in many parts of the world, but also in ancient times, are Christian practices. I mean, they are the original Christian practices. However, I think as a result of, you know, extraction methods and colonial influences, Christianity has lost that. And I think Christian practices kind of are the antithesis of Indigenous practices now, which is really sad, because, you know, as Christians, we're called to live in harmony with the earth, with you know, each other, you know, loving our neighbors as we love, you know, our God. But we don't really see that in action anymore. So yeah, I'm not sure that they are quite aligned.
Where do you see the main differences?
Yeah, I think the main differences started, you know, when the doctrine of discovery, you know, was put into place, and, you know, Constantine basically, you know, told the entire empire that anyone who is not a Christian and lives on land, basically that land is up for grabs, and they are not worth saving, which is the antithesis of, you know, the biblical gospel, right? And, you know, that was as a result of, you know, individualistic, self-interest, loving, you know, conquest and power grabbing sort of needs. So yeah, I think, you know, we really need to reflect on the history of Christianity as we know it today, and sit in the discomfort, and realize that, yes, the gospel is very good, but it was not good for the majority of the world in the way that it was, you know, imposed, and the way that it was practiced to serve people's self-interests.
Where do you see the main similarities, if you see similarities?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think, you know, the only main similarities are that we are all people, and people are still fallible. That's probably the only similarity that I see. I don't think that there's anything else that we can say is the same, you know, within contemporary Christianity and Indigenous practices.
According to you, what is the best way of reconciling or balancing both traditions, Indigenous and Christian?
Yeah, reconcile is a really interesting word, because, like, the gospel is all about reconciliation, right? And how do we do reconciliation in a way that is meaningful and sustainable, and, you know, yeah, loving ultimately. And I think within the context of the country that we live on, this land that we call Australia, reconciliation might not even be an option if we don't acknowledge the history, right? Like the horrific history, and people coming to terms with the church's complicity. So, you know, how much damage and involvement the church had to do with genocide on Indigenous peoples here. And then, okay, you know, what does the Bible instruct us to do in terms of, you know, repairing relationships? You know, I think of Zacchaeus, the tax collector who stole in self-interest. and how he didn't just repay what he stole, but he repaid 4 times the loss. You know, and that sort of justice and equity is what we need to be considering if we really want to talk about reconciliation and also reconciling Christianity with indigeneity.
For those educators and teachers, whether they're in Christian or non-Christian schools and preschools, do you have any tips for including Indigenous perspectives meaningfully while avoiding tokenism?
Yeah, look, I think, you know, whatever country you're on, like we're on direct country here, it's really important that our practices are centered on the local country. And that might mean that you need to do a bit of work and research and get in touch with your local Aboriginal land council, get in touch with community groups, leaders and elders, and ask them to you know, share their knowledge, pay them appropriately. You know, don't expect free labor, which is what we often expect of our Indigenous community members. And use their, you know, 65,000 plus years worth of insight and experience and expertise to shape your curriculum. Because we know that, you know, particularly here on this continent, 230 plus years ago, this was a thriving continent. You know, there were 300 plus countries living on this land. And, you know, in 1770, things changed and, you know, the land has become very broken. So I guess like reflecting on that again and saying, and realizing that we do need to put Indigenous practices and ideas and knowledges front and center in everything that we do and teach. I think we can really, you know, give our students a really rich pedagogical sort of learning experience.
In your experience as teacher and as educational consultant, have you seen any barriers to this meaningful inclusion of Indigenous perspectives in schools, preschools, or elsewhere?
Yeah, so I guess like I'm also the founder of an organization called We Are the Mainstream. And one of the biggest barriers that we come across is people really just being unwilling to shift their mindsets because it requires a little bit of self-reflection and introspection, right? So that's probably one of the main issues. And people being unwilling to redistribute power. So that is people who are in positions of privilege and power, you know, us reaching out or vice versa, and them being unwilling to actually share resources because there's a fear of scarcity, right? And a fear that, oh, but if I give this little up, then what do I have? So yeah, I guess trying to get people to move out of a very hyper individualistic sort of mindset into a more collective one, which in itself is an Indigenous practice, is probably one that we come across in educational spaces. Another really interesting one is, I guess, the apathy that a lot of teachers have alongside the uninterest and the lack of knowledge that, you know, they quote, you know, oh, I didn't know that about Indigenous history, when there are so many resources out there that can, you know, they can really be actively, you know, self-teaching, which is what we claim to be lifelong learners, but there's often a bit of like apathy when it comes to Indigenous learning. And I wonder if that has to do with guilt, and I wonder if that has to do with fear. And I wonder if it has to do with, well, what am I going to have to do with this now that I know? And so, yeah, moving out of apathy, moving out of guilt into places of equity and into places of collaboration and consultation with groups who do actually have Indigenous knowledge and practices that they're willing to share, I think is the way to go.
If educators and teachers who are watching this want to explore this topic further, where would you point them to? Do you have any favorite books or videos or movies, people that inspired you? And then tell us about your organization.
Sure. So I can think of 4 documentaries that I would really recommend. The first one is called First Australians. I believe it's still on SBS. You should be able to access it for free. Then there is Kanini. That's spelled Kanyini, and it's a beautiful documentary. I mean, I used it nearly 10 years ago with my history class when I used to teach at a Christian school, and beautifully explores like the pillars that uphold Indigenous practices. So that's a really fantastic one, led by Uncle Bob Randall. Then there is In My Blood It Runs, which is fabulous. If you're an educator, it's something you must watch. And the last one that I'd really recommend is Incarceration Nation, which, yeah, is heartbreaking, but again, it's part of our country's history and contemporary stories. So as educators, again, it's something that I really recommend you watch. People who inspire me, that's a really interesting question. I can think of one particular person, Larissa Minicon from the Minicon family, her, father and mother, Uncle Ray Minicon, Auntie Sharon Minicon, they're leaders who I sit under and I listen to and I learn so much from, and I wouldn't have it any other way. And their leadership is so unlike any, normal / colonial leadership that you will know. So yeah, I would certainly consider looking Scarred Tree Indigenous Ministries up and finding out how you can get involved with their ministry, but also, get involved with your local Indigenous groups. Find out how you can pay the rent on the country that you live on, whether that be by doing monthly donations to like a land council or a local Indigenous-led group, which is something I'd really recommend everyone does here anyway. And yeah, a little bit about We Are the Mainstream. We are a collective, we're community-led and funded, we're volunteer-led, and we exist for and by First Nations and gender diverse and women of colour. And we were founded just because there was a real underrepresentation of organisations that spoke of our stories by us and shared our stories and our insights and our expertise and our lived experience. And we have it all, it's all there, but we need to be the ones who tell those stories. So yeah, we are a small team, but we do cultural competency training. We also do corporate and small organisation leadership mentoring, and we run workshops and training sessions as well. So you can find us online at wearethemainstream.org.
Well, this inquiry is now finished. The questions are still popping up and there'll be more questions coming, but at this point in time, I don't have any energy, time and desire to explore this further at this stage. There are 3 series. Thanks very much if you've been part of this journey. Ultimately, this is for educators and teachers because you are there reconciling, balancing, integrating, embedding both traditions or one tradition or 2 traditions or many other traditions together. So it's really actually for you. You have lots of resources in the video description, and any feedback, let me know. I'm Jan from Sustainable Butterflies and it's been an incredible journey. Thanks very much for your support and you have a great day. Bye.